Namaskar. Thank you very much. ANDT कला और वाणिज्य महिला महाविद्यालय पुणे हिंदी विभाग and my host Dr. Shivdat from the Department of Hindi and my very dear student from IGNO and a scholar and a poet in his own rights for having invited me to deliver this special lecture in your university on the topic reimagining knowledge systems, the new education policy, and the epistemic engagements of languages. I have prepared on the topic the national education policy, its practical and theoretical approaches, its multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary approaches, the pedagogy and the research methodology for the implementation of the NEP guidelines in the university system, and how to bring Indian knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, and Hindu studies kinds of courses to our departments and our disciplines. I belong to the English department. I have been teaching English literature since last 25 years in many universities, and today I am the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, West Bengal, which is basically a language university. So my approach to languages is very, very flexible and very inclusive. Hindi University is a language university, and we are in the process of designing multiple MA programs in all the Indian languages, folk languages, and tribal languages, and we are truly living the NEP guidelines. In going to my background at IGNO as a professor, we have handled the NEP, the multiple entry and exit options through our many academic programs, including our MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, which started with a diploma with an entry and exit option, and through a lateral entry, the second year courses of MA FCS, MA in Folklore and Culture Studies. So whatever the NEP is introducing in the universities through its guidelines, we have already been living those things, and we are learning new things from the NEP. This lecture today, it interrogates the entanglements of the National Education Policy NEP 2020, which is popularly, quote unquote, miscalled the new education policy, and the epistemic features and futures of languages, especially endangered and indigenous tongues. My research situates NEP against a longer genealogy of Indian education policy regimes from the Radhakrishnan and the Kothari commissions to the 1968 and 1986 and 92 policies, the 2005 NCF, the 2009 RTE Act, and it examines how NEP's promised flexibility, multilingualism, and Indian knowledge systems engage with the socio-economic stratification, federalism, and privatization. Drawing on frameworks from folklore studies as a folklorist myself, and then cultural studies, Hindu studies, and Indian knowledge systems, the colonial and post-colonial theories, linguistic anthropology. My research argues that NEP reimagines knowledge systems in very ambitious terms, but also there are the risks of re-centralizing the curricular power, marketing education, and instrumentalizing languages as heritage commodities rather than just living epistemes. So this is where the role of such seminars and conferences that Dr. Shiv and the University of Pune you have organized comes from or comes towards. The teachers of languages and literatures have a major responsibility of understanding the pedagogy of NEP and then bringing those ideas to the university table for brainstorming, for critical engagements, for discussions. And I must congratulate the organizers for this kind of a program where people come with their ideas, exchange their debates and ideas, and ultimately, we hope that we will come up with some pedagogical offer for the proper and the critical engagement of the NEP. My research offers a critical apparatus, many research questions, and future research pathways towards an ethically grounded, community responsive, and linguistically justified implementation. The keywords that I use are NEP 2020, endangered languages, Indian knowledge systems, English studies, Hindu studies, folk literature, cultural studies, decoloniality, multilingualism, higher education, policy studies, language justice, archives, ethics. Let us begin with a proverb from the Gond community. What they say is, the earth is not to be owned, it owns us. This is an approach through the Anthropocene where we are taught by the planet Earth that human beings are not the only important species on the earth. Rather, they should learn to cohabit with all other species, and it gives importance to green studies, ocean humanities, folklore, cultural studies, and many such things which are coming up as a part of our departmental research and studies, and which is again given a lot of importance by the NEP. This points to an ontology where knowledge is custodianship, not extraction. And then my question is, how does NEP 2020 reconceive the knowledge systems? What is knowledge and what is a knowledge system? Probably, put it simplistically, knowledge is something that we receive from different resources and sources, and knowledge system is when we present the acquired knowledge in a systematic manner through research, through syllabus, and through teaching, creative writing, and research for the future generations. What does it do to and for languages, especially to the endangered and the indigenous? How do folk literature and oral archives figure within a policy that promises flexibility and rootedness? Languages are at a risk today. What counts as language preservation? Out of the 7 lakh languages in the world, today we have only 7,000 languages. What happened to the other languages? They certainly had a natural death without anyone creating archives or documenting them or preserving them. NEP looks for the preservation of the endangered languages and literatures and cultural heritages. India hosts hundreds of languages and thousands of speech varieties. Many of them are endangered. Preservation cannot mean mere museumization. It must support intergenerational transmission, domain expansion in home, school, market, through the digital media, through an economic viability. There are field snapshots like the Bhutia Rang in Uttarakhand. It talks about the revitalization through local radio and school clubs, Kui language in Odisha, for example, oral epics and ritual song traditions. They face pressures from many groups, but still they are surviving. And it's the responsibility of experts and teachers of language to preserve that. For example, the Saurya Paharia languages from Jharkhand and Bihar, they are going through documentation through livelihood linkages via craft and songs. I would like to argue for community-led archives, living dictionaries, folk text repositories, fables, proverbs, and parables in our syllabus, and curricular inclusion through multilingual pedagogies. Indian knowledge systems and Hindu studies, folk literatures, they travel between rootedness and instrumentality. NEP foregrounds Indian knowledge systems, giving importance to literature through astronomy, mathematics, Ayurveda, poetics, ethics, craft, performative and oral traditions, alongside the Hindu studies programs proliferating across the campuses. Here, I would take a pause and like to inform the participants that when I took 4 years leave from IGNOR to join as the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University in West Bengal, my parting gift for IGNOR was a course titled Stories from Epics, Puranas and Siddhantas, where we have taken a very scientific, astronomical and technological approach towards Hindu studies and Indian knowledge systems. For example, we have chapters like the geometrical patterns in the Kurukshetra, the mathematics behind it. We have surrogacy and childbirth and the medical approach towards that. Or we have aviation technology and the Pushpak Viman without claiming that there actually was a Pushpak Viman in the Ramayana, rather giving credit to the power of imagination of our knowledge systems. Indian knowledge systems should have a scientific and a pedagogical approach and a proper research methodology, failing which we will end up telling stories in our classrooms. That is, there is this word of caution. We have to prevent civilizational triumphalism, prevent IKs as a pluriversal archive. We have to think about Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, Adivasi, Sufi, Bhakti, folk, tribal epistemologists, and regional Sanskrit and Persian, Tamil and Malayalam, Maithili, and other intellectual histories while we talk about Indian knowledge systems in our Indian classrooms. I read somewhere that you should never fear a person with a library. Rather, you should be careful about a person who has just one book which he hasn't read. This is such a loaded statement. Our Indian knowledge systems, they are not just one text. We are a multicultural and multi-textual country. So probably when we introduce Indian knowledge systems in English classrooms or any language classroom per se, we have to think about all those texts that we have been trained with while including new texts. I do not belong to that school of thought, being a teacher of English, who would like to get rid of whatever trainings we have received till our childhood. That is where I have designed so many courses for my university on British literature, British romantic poetry, post-colonial literature, American poetry, American drama, and children's literature, and I have been successfully teaching those while I have included more number of courses on folklore and culture studies and on Hindu studies and Indian knowledge systems. We have to embed folk literature like bowl songs, hill parables, Santali mythology, Kashmiri poetry, not as folklore as spectacle, but as folklore as a living theory, epistemic modes of reasoning and pedagogy. Let us question ourselves. Flexibility or stratification? What is the idea? NEP promises flexibility, multiple entry and exit options, academic bank of credits, multidisciplinary majors and minors, no doubt. While we glorify these ideas and we work hard to introduce courses where multidisciplinary approaches can be there, but we have to take care of the risk factor. Flexibility without social protection may deepen stratification. First generation learners become stop outs, while elites stack the credentials. The purpose is equity firewalls are there, need-based grants, language bridge semesters, recognition of prior learning in indigenous knowledges and canonical studies, and rural internships are something that we should consider while we deconstruct the NEP. Governance, federalism, and markets are things that we have to rethink. NEP centralizes standards while devolving implementation to the states, which is a productive tension if participatory, a risk if it sidelines the state boards and the local languages and the mother tongues. NEP talks about family languages, community languages, state languages. India doesn't have a national language, so it talks about the constitutionally approved languages, and then the tribal and the folk languages, and then international languages. NEP, one has to go through step by step. Private and transnational providers have the dangers of fee inflation, credentialization, and policy drift towards employability only metrics. There are many courses which are not exactly and only for employment. For example, this MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, the program MAFCS, at least 50% of the students do this program for enhancement of their knowledge. They are already doctors, engineers, professors. They are performers. They are theater specialists. Even they are filmmakers. They are professors and directors, and they join this course, this program, for the enhancement of their knowledge. Another 50% definitely ask me, what is the employability of folk literature? So I give them many ideas like, museums, national museums, universities, archives, film industries, then research departments, cultural centers. Many of them are looking for people with expertise in folk literature, and also there is a UGC NET examination on folk literature. So having a UGC NET examination, folk literature has created employability. Through NEP, we have to insist on language justice, public funding, and independent quality assurance, which are sensitive to multilingualism. We have to have a research agenda and call for action. MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, like programs, they integrate Indian knowledge systems plus cultural studies plus cultural linguistics, anthropology, and digital humanities in a big way. A river that stops flowing becomes a swamp. So policies must flow, but with ethical banks. We have to introduce language and the policies of knowledge, where NEP 2020 intensifies the debates over curriculum, governance, market, and identity. That is how these kind of seminars and conferences and programs, and also the syllabus design committees, they have to brainstorm. Its language on mother tongue, multilingualism, and Indian knowledge systems appear to reconcile local rootedness with global competitiveness. Yet, the policy's normative center remains contested. Are languages being reclaimed as the living epistemes or repurposed as symbolic capital? Are folk literatures and indigenous knowledge systems co-authors of curricula or ornamental add-ons only? My research offers a critical reading anchored in folklore studies, decolonial thinking, and language justice scholarship. NEP 2020 is officially the national education policy. It is not merely or simply a new policy. How long a new remains new, isn't it? The slippage matters. Calling it new foregrounds its novelty, calling it national foregrounds its jurisdiction and identity. The designation national invokes constitutional obligations, linguistics, federalism, minority rights, state autonomy, good governance in curricular matters. This nomenclature shapes how we read textual commitments on languages and Indian knowledge systems. Now, there are many education policies since the independence of India. For example, from Radhakrishnan to NEP 2020, let us just have a quick look. Radhakrishnan Commission in 1948 and 49, it envisioned university autonomy, liberal learning systems, and research orientation. Definitely, post-independence, this was required. Now, the Secondary Education Commission between 1952 and 53, it reformed the secondary schooling and the vocational streams. Vocational education came up, or it was introduced, the idea was introduced in the Secondary Education Commission. Then the Kothari Commission talked about, it was in 1964 to 66, if I'm correct. It thought about education and national development, common schooling, three-language formula, and public investments in education. The NPE 1968 operationalized TLF, emphasized regional languages and Hindi-English in varying constellations. NPE 1968 and POA 1992, it was child-centered curricula, teacher education, train the trainers, and adult literary campaigns. Adult education came up in a big way. The NCF 2005, it thought about the constructivist pedagogy, multilingual education, cultural diversity. The RTE Act 2009 was about rights-based framework, inclusion, and the neighborhood schools. Then the draft NEP 2019, NEP 2020, it took all the education policies till date into consideration and created something very flexible and inclusive. It thought about modularity, exit and entry options, multidisciplinary, multilinguistic ethics, Indian knowledge systems, technology governance, and heightened the talk of mother tongue instruction in the early years. The continuities are rhetorics of equity and multilingualism. The departures are market-facing modularization, intensified central standard setting, and a civilizational register via IKS. Endangered languages, which are beyond preservation and which are towards repertoire expansion, are the functional domains of NEP. Schooling, local administration, health communication, digital culture are the points of emphasis. For hundreds of Indian languages like Santali, Kui, Gond, Bhutia, Rang, Malto, Toto, Nishi, NEP's promises translate into curricular insertion through texts and theory, through local literatures, proverbs, riddles, fables, parables, folk narratives, and many other things. The teacher pipelines from the community through teacher training, orthography support, including scripts like OI, Chiki for Shantali, and community media through FM podcasts and all of that. Economic linkages through craft, ecotourism, translation cooperatives to make language and literature a livelihood asset. Isn't it so interesting in the part of NEP? The challenge is not documentation alone, but intergenerational retention through purpose, pride, and payments. Folk literature and indigenous knowledge systems have moved from tokenism to co-curriculum, and they have become mediums of instruction as well as livelihood. NEP's invocation of IKS will remain thin unless folk literatures are treated as co-equal knowledge partners. And then there are examples like reading Baul Dehotattva songs as phenomenology, Bhil parables as ethics, Santali epics as historiography, Mizo lullabies as pedagogy, Assamese proverbs as micro-theory, and so on and so forth. Designing credit-bearing studios with community knowledge bearers as co-teachers and recognizing prior learning for artisans, healers, and storytellers is the key. Establishing community-run archives with shared governance, ensuring benefit sharing and co-authorship norms are important. In higher education, Hindu studies can be introduced through theorization and practical approaches. Comparative perspectives, historical policies should be given a lot of importance. India's educational trajectory has been shaped by successful policies that I already discussed, and the NEP 2020, which is slightly divergent from the earlier trajectories. It recenters epistemic debates on flexibility, interdisciplinarity, and indigenous knowledge systems, thereby repositioning India within a global knowledge economy while claiming to return to quote unquote roots. This simultaneity, cosmopolitan and indigenous, global and local, makes NEP very, very distinctive. Yet, this diversion is challenged by critics who argue that despite its rhetoric of inclusivity, NEP risks homogenization. For instance, the promotion of a couple of languages within higher education could marginalize and endanger the tribal and the folk languages. Simultaneously, the reduction of rigid disciplinary boundaries does not guarantee equitable resource distribution. Without proper funding, language preservation programs risk being tokenistic rather than transformative. So, this is where teachers like you and me have to play our respective and very important roles. Socio-economic implementations and implications of language endangerment under NEP is something that your program should look into. The epistemic engagement of languages under NEP extends beyond academia. It carries socio-economic consequences. Languages are tied to livelihood. For example, tribal artisans' oral traditions are both cultural heritage and economic practice. When endangered languages vanish, economic ecosystems collapse with them. The commodification of culture under global tourism frequently sidelines indigenous voices, echoing Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's caution about the subaltern voice being appropriated. NEP's ambition to digitize and document languages must be interrogated and re-examined. Who benefits from the digital archives and who controls them? Is it for the common masses or is it only for the empowered? And the teachers like you should work on it. Moreover, the flexibility that NEP offers, multiple entry-exit points in degree programs, vocational integration, and credit transfer, it can be double-edged if you are not looking at carefully. While it democratizes access, it can also precarize marginalized learners who may exit education early due to economic constraints, thereby reinforcing inequalities rather than dissolving them. So the first year programs, the compulsory courses should be very, very carefully chosen. Probably the second year courses, the elective courses can be more specific, but the first year courses where people have the possibility of taking an exit should be emphasized and created with a lot of care and concern for the subaltern. Hindu studies, Indian knowledge systems, and cultural reclamation under NEP have sparked debates. On the one hand, this represents a decolonial turn, reclaiming Vedic mathematics, Ayurveda, and folk epistemologies suppressed under colonial education. On the other hand, critics caution against the communalization of curriculum. For example, privileging epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana while sidelining tribal oral epics or some other marginalized and Dalit narratives risks producing hegemonies. A critical approach requires situating Hindu studies within comparative contexts, creating comparative world literature pedagogies, juxtaposing the Mahabharata with Shantal creation myths or Ayurvedic principles with Baiga medicinal practices. Only then can IKS avoid becoming exclusionary and instead foster pluralistic epistemologies. Endangered languages and the NEP's preservation mandate are interesting and important. Globally, the UNESCO estimates that one language dies every 2 weeks. In India, languages like Toto, Pirhor, Nihali, they face imminent extinction because of the lack of preservation. That is where folklorists like you and me should come forward. NEP 2020 acknowledges the urgency of preservation, but operational clarity is lacking. Universities should work on these things. They should bring the syllabus to the table for re-evaluation. Community-led documentation remains more effective than state-led archiving, as seen in the Maori language revival in New Zealand. NEP must empower communities by providing infrastructure for local institutions to teach in mother tongues, and then incentivizing folk documentation and linking oral tradition to digital humanities. Otherwise, preservation risks become mere museumization. Folklore is not something very romantic. We need not museumize folklore, romanticize folklore and watch it from a distance, which has been done since decades in the country. Now it's time that folklore and indigenous knowledge systems should be brought to the table and talked about. My critical questions before I conclude are: how does NEP 2020 configure the epistemic legitimacy of indigenous languages vis-a-vis dominant global languages like English? To what extent does the promotion of Sanskrit within NEP challenge or reinforce linguistic hierarchies in India? How do endangered languages intersect with economic sustainability in marginalized communities? Can NEP's interdisciplinary framework genuinely integrate folk literature and indigenous epistemologies without reducing them to cultural capital? What parallels can be drawn between NEP's treatment of IKS and global policies on indigenous knowledge preservation? For example, Maori, First Nations, Native American models? In what ways do socio-economic inequalities complicate the flexibility of NEP's multi-exit educational frameworks? How might NEP risk producing hegemonies by privileging one kind of approach over equally rich tribal or Dalit epistemologies? To what degree are digital archives under NEP empowering the local communities versus commodifying their knowledge systems? How can folklore and oral literatures be critically positioned within NEP without reducing them to performative heritages? Does NEP's epistemic framework suggest a genuine paradigm shift from colonial legacies, or is it yet another selective nationalism? Please think over these questions and try to answer to these questions coming few days during this program. There are future research possibilities for this subject, comparative studies, comparative world literatures of indigenous language preservations across continents to evaluate NEP against the global standards. Impact studies of NEP on actual classroom practices, especially in rural and tribal schools. Digital humanities projects analyzing how oral literature is being archived under NEP initiatives and whether metadata or curation practices reproduce the hierarchies. Critical ethnographies of communities engaged in Hindu studies and Indian knowledge systems programs to explore inclusivity versus exclusion. Policy analysis, contrasting NEP 2020 with earlier education policies to track continuities and ruptures in epistemic policies. Economic dimensions, particularly how NEP addresses or it fails to address the language-linked livelihoods. Reimagining knowledge systems through the lens of NEP requires vigilance, as I have been talking since last 40 minutes. While it gestures towards plurality, interdisciplinarity, and reclamation of the IKS, the risk of homogenization and tokenism looms large. Endangered languages, folk literature, and indigenous knowledge systems can thrive under NEP only if the policy invests in community-led preservations, inclusive pedagogy, and ethical documentation practices. Ultimately, NEP 2020 is neither simply a national education policy nor merely a new education policy to me. It is an epistemic battleground where India must negotiate between decolonial recovery and neo-nationalist appropriation. The task for scholars, policymakers, administrators, and educators is to ensure that this negotiation remains open to discussion, plural, and critically engaged. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. Now, this paper is open for discussion and questions. Thank you once again.